Hey there, students. This is Mr. Sharp again, here for the last video in American History 1. We've made it. We're now at the end of Reconstruction, and when we're done with this, you guys have to study for your final. But it's almost to the end. So let's get into this. So we've talked a lot about stuff in American History 1 so far. And now that we're coming to the end, one thing I just want you to know, it's not done. You've got American History 2 coming up. Not only that, but you're living in American history every day. And that's something that we're going to really see with the impacts that we see from the end of Reconstruction, something that is very prevalent that still saw itself reemerge in the Civil Rights Act, or Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, even today with controversies over police brutality that we see between different groups. We're still living with this stuff, and it feels like it's all coming back from these impacts from Reconstruction. So our objectives today, we're going to be looking at why and how Reconstruction ended, and we're also going to look at what were some of the successes and failures of Reconstruction, and what was it like for the newly freed enslaved persons, the African Americans who lived in the South during the Reconstruction, and how's that going to impact them once it all comes to a close? So let's get into it. Your key terms today are going to be including right up here in the slide. You can pause it whenever you need to take a look at them, but we're going to be looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1875 all the way to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, which is in itself kind of a cluster F, Compromise of 1877, and then we're going to start to see some of the start to what we see in the South truly at the end of Reconstruction. That includes segregation, Jim Crow laws, poll taxes. In addition to that, we'll also see who are some of the strong advocate voices for African Americans moving into the late 1800s, like Booker T. Washington, W.D. Du Bois, and Ida B. Wells. So let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? So far in this unit, we've talked about Reconstruction, what it meant, the plans for Reconstruction for both Abraham Lincoln, the most radical Republicans, and Andrew Johnson. It seemed like Andrew Johnson's plan was the more prevalent one, and the Republicans were trying to fight him against it. And after that, we started to see how Southerners started to react to Reconstruction. But at this time, later in 1870s, Reconstruction is starting to lose its momentum from Republican support, just because the Republican Party is not just worried about reconstructing the South. They have their eyes set everywhere across the country. They're looking to grow industry in the North. They're also looking to move more people out west to grow more cities and grow more farms. So the South is starting to become like we got to get to that in a little bit soon, but we'll deal with it later. And it's kind of losing its momentum and it's losing support quick. So as General Grant now, President Grant, is about to go into a second term of office in 1872 and 1872, he's starting to become a little bit more of a figure of more corruption, more so than a Republican rule by many Democrats, both in the North and the South. That's going to tarnish his reputation a little bit. And not only that, but in his second term, he's going to help to try and pass the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which sounds like it should be a good thing, right? It should be giving rights to all citizens, including African Americans in the South. But the problem was they allowed lower courts to interpret the manner of which those laws should be read at both the state and local levels. So the Civil Rights Act would allow African Americans to go into public spaces and private institutions in order to participate, but it allowed those state and local courts to kind of interpret how they should follow suit with that law. So you would see local levels of government, state governments to say, okay, yes, African Americans can participate in this thing, but you have to go at this certain time, or you have to be segregated. This is your own person. This is a white only, and this is a black only segment. So it really started to show the emergence of segregation in the South. And we're also going to see a return of Southern Democratic rule in the South. When we talked last time in our last one with the South changes, or Reconstruction changes the South, we started to see a rise of violence against African American voters and white Republicans in order to gain back control. And it really worked. With a lack of Republican support to stop all this violence, it started to spur a control back to white Democrats to lead political parties in the South. starting to remove a lot of former Republican African-American officials, now replacing them with Southern white Democrats. And if you guys don't believe me, in the 1870s, the first African-American governor was elected in Louisiana and served for 40 years, and that was in the 1870s. The next African-American governor would not be elected back into any state in the Union until 1989. That kind of proves to you that African-Americans wouldn't really play a big role in politics until really in the late 1900s, and we're talking like 100 years after the Reconstruction. And also, we're about to see a new controversy come up because with the return of Southern white Democratic control in the Senate and Congress and also in other state courts, now that we're coming into a new election and Grant has to step back, we have a new run for president, and that's going to be against Samuel Tilson and Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican, while Samuel Tilson is the New York elected Democrat. So the election is kind of a funny one to talk about. So the story behind it is during the election, both guys are getting kind of an equal balance of popular votes and electoral votes. But there was some election disputes or voting fraud that were in a couple of states, in Florida and South Carolina and Louisiana. Remind me if this sounds familiar at all, like for this 2020 election. Just kidding. Anyway, with all that fraud, there was a lot of controversy back and forth, and both nominees would get about the same amount of electoral votes. Tilson would get the most electoral votes, but not enough to win enough electoral votes to win the presidency. So the problem was set now to Congress to decide who shall be president. So the House of Representatives is supposed to vote by all members, but instead what they decided to do is make a 15-man committee to decide. And it was made up of 15 members. 7 of them were Democrats, 8 of them were Republicans. Yeah, that kind of messes up the voting a little bit in the favor of the Republicans. So what happens? Rutherford B. Hayes is going to be the president after a 15-man committee vote. And it seemed to the Democrats, they're like, what? No. That was rigged. And yeah, everybody likes to say it was rigged if they didn't win. So they're just like children. Anyway, so in order for Rutherford B. Hayes to really calm down the Democratic Party and to see that there's a compromise to be made, that he's been elected president, there's going to be kind of a bargain between the two parties. And this is often called the Compromise of 1877. And what it did was officially end the military occupation, the military districts of the South, and it returned the southern states to a normalcy. And it also said that Republican nominees and Republican politicians will not interfere anymore in Southern affairs with Reconstruction. They will not meddle in legal affairs at the court level, at political level, and they will also ensure that Reconstruction efforts have come to an end. So the Compromise of 1877 is what truly ends Reconstruction. And you guys can check out this timeline. You can pause this video to take a look at it when you want to see like where it all started back in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, all the way to 1877 when Rutherford B. Hayes puts out that compromise and officially ends the Reconstruction era. So one thing I just want to point out though, with the end of Reconstruction, what's that going to mean? Well, with the return of a lot of these white Democratic officials, it's going to start to hit home that, hey, we now have control of everything once more. So all this stuff about extending civil rights to newly freed African Americans, yeah, we can toy with the system a little bit to make sure it's returned in our favor and strip those rights away. Just like this U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Morrison Watt, who's going to start to be more in favor of pulling back or revoking a lot of those protective laws that were in favor of extending civil rights to African Americans, and that's going to play out all throughout the different levels of government. And you guys, real quick, if you want to learn more about the election, this chart is a very good breakdown of what happens, as well as the map, and you can oddly see, like, Texas is blue, huh? Texas has hardly ever been blue in the past, and California is red. What in the world is going on here? It's like I'm in upside down land. Okay, in all seriousness, did Reconstruction succeed or fail? That's been the big topic of a lot of historians over the years, and it's not an easy question to answer because you have to think to yourself, um, did it truly give African Americans full equality? Because we still see there's inequalities today, and it was fought for over 150 years after the Reconstruction. Not only that, but we still see the South as a somewhat of a rural area compared to the northern states, but we also see that it starts to boom in industry after the Reconstruction era and becomes actually more of a industrial productive area more so than the north. So did it really change things or did it actually make things worse? Well, let's start to look at some of the things here that actually made the impact. First off, it cannot be understated that African Americans truly had a new sense of a new start to their own lives. You see a increase of African American landowners from 5% of their population all the way up to 40 between 1870 and 1910. Not only that, but it also brings more autonomy to African Americans who can both work for wages, who can, even though they're working primarily as sharecroppers or as tenant farmers, are still earning money to make their own autonomy. You're also going to see kind of a rise of the women's suffrage movement because Republicans were so naive and so inept to start giving voting rights to women. That's going to spur more women to get back behind the backs of women's suffragettes all the way up until the 1890s. We're also going to see political party allegiances start to be established between the Republicans and the Democrats, and that's still alive today. They are still the two main parties of the United States. Although they're going to have changes in their platforms after 150 years, they're still the two main ones. And it also brings into question who has more authority, the state or the federal government. It seemed after Reconstruction, the federal government has more power, and it's still seen as the law of the land. It goes back to at the end of the Civil War when we stopped considering ourselves North Carolinians or Virginians. We're now considering ourselves Americans because we see the federal government is going to play more roles in protecting civil liberties, even if it means stepping on state and local governments. So, and you can see some more effects of Reconstruction. We're going to see some bad ones too. Obviously, this is going to be it's going to cause the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, sharecropping in the South that affected poor farmers, both white and African American. And also it devastates the Southern economy and infrastructure. So there's both good and bad things to this. But let's leave with what the legacy was. What was Reconstruction's true legacy? Well, we have to look at it from the perspective of those who were brought out of slavery from this whole unit, this whole class. We've been talking about how slavery plays a big role in American history, and now it's over. So now we have to start looking forward to what are the next challenges to face. So obviously in the South with Reconstruction done, even though slavery is done, white Democrats are still going to put into place different laws, different black codes that are going to essentially limit the civil liberties of African Americans by instituting Jim Crow laws, replacing those old black codes with laws to enforce segregation in schools and public settings and private institutions. It's also going to place state and local limits on voting rights, putting in poll taxes and literacy tests to essentially rig the system against African American voters. And this system of segregation is going to spread all throughout the South to be kind of a state of normal life. And that's not going to be challenged really truly challenged until the 1950s. So this is the mark that leaves after Reconstruction. But what it does leave is also the voices that are going to advocate for full equality and civil liberties. Some of those people are going to include Booker T. Washington, W.E. Du Bois, Ida Wells, who are going to write about the plights of African Americans. Though they are free, they still fight for this idea of civil equality, equal opportunities with all Americans. That's going to end it, guys. I'll see you next time.